Now let's talk a little bit with Karen about her new book, which looks like this: Women of Valor, Orthodox Jewish troll fighters, crime writers, and rock stars in contemporary literature and culture. This topic is of immense interest to many of us, and apparently to a broader audience as well. Perhaps it's something about the appeal of Orthodox women juggling two worlds, two values, two ways of looking at things that brings the outside in. But let's start with what Marian thinks of it, what Karen thinks of it. Why don't you start, Karen, by telling us all how you got interested in this topic? Why did you decide to write this book?
Thanks, Sylvia. So I guess I was really interested in a lot of different kinds of ethnic and immigrant literature, and I wasn't that interested in looking at Jewish literature for a long time. I think because it was so much a part, Jewishness was so much a part of my personal life that I wanted to keep things maybe a little separate. But I had a growing irritation with representations of Orthodoxy, and particularly Orthodox women. There was an upsurge, and it's still going on, starting maybe the end of the 20th century, beginning of the 21st century, and of these images of Orthodoxy. So we had Tova Reich and Naomi Reagan writing their novels. We had films like A Price Above Rubies and Kadosh, and all these different depictions, even showing up in things like Law and Order, various articles. And I found myself really unsatisfied with the representations that were out there. Very often it seemed that only men were addressed, and they were addressed as a sea of black hats, right? So indistinguishable, but also entirely male, right? The focus would very much be on the male attire. Black hat, in fact, is often used as an expression to refer to the ultra-Orthodox, right? Again, as if there's only one gender. And when women did show up in these pictures, it seemed to me they were oppressed, they were victimized. I'm in the dark here. They were baby machines, they were subservient, and they really didn't match with the real Orthodox women that I knew. And I mean that in terms of a range of Orthodox people, women. My family is very traditional. My husband's family is modern Orthodox, but they also, part of their family is Chassidisha, they're Bobov. Many of my friends are from different Orthodox communities. And I just couldn't see how these representations fit with the real people that I knew. So that's sort of what started my interest in the project.
So I noticed that one of the things that you do is make it very, very apparent that Orthodox women are not all the same. You have an enormous emphasis on diversity.
Yes.
You also have an enormous emphasis on diversity of genres. You're looking at serious fiction, at romances, detective novels, memoirs, graphic novels. And as I was reading your wonderful book, I was wondering how you deal with these different genres. Did you approach them all the same? Did you have the same expectations of them?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And I think the answer is, I mean, the reason I looked at so many genres is I wanted to suggest that very diversity that you note, right? I wanted to think about all the different possibilities that were out there, both in terms of women, but also in terms of the ways that they engage with culture. I think that I'll just note that if I were to write this today, and I didn't finish so long ago, but even a year later, I feel there's a difference. I would engage much more deeply with new media. So something like Instagram is a place now where there are so many Orthodox women involved. And I think a lot of this started with the From Women Have Faces campaign. So this issue that's been going on in some Haredi circles where they're omitting women's faces from publications, from photographs, deleting them, photoshopping them out. And there's been a response by women of inserting their faces. And then doing all kinds of wonderful things on new media. So, you know, I would say, I think it could be even more diverse in terms of genre, but it's hard to treat all of it the exact same. And I think something like the film industry that I talk about, which is very much made under some strict guidelines. If they go outside of those guidelines, chances are those films will never see the light of day. They're made for a very particular audience. It doesn't mean that other women can't watch the films, but they're really made for Orthodox women. It's hard to put the same critical eye on that as a novel by Allegra Goodman, who is, you know, she's a critically acclaimed novelist. Her work is taught in many university courses. And I think it's a little bit unfair to treat them identically. But at the same time, what I found is that there are many surprises, and that if we look at someone like Faye Kellerman, and I had never read a book by Faye Kellerman before starting this, and a friend of mine said to me, "You will be surprised." And the truth is, I was surprised. I think that her treatment of issues of Orthodox womanhood is so complex and so deep and so rich that my own, to be honest, low expectations coming to that book were really challenged, and to that whole series.
Did you find that the different genres actually selected out different kinds of Orthodox women to deal with? Like, is Faye Kellerman or the films or Allegra Goodman, were there different kinds of Orthodox women that almost had a franchise in different genres, or was that diversity spread around through all of the genres?
I think it was different in different cases. So someone like Faye Kellerman, and I talk about other detective fiction in that chapter, but she really does have something of a monopoly. She's such a popular writer. She's so widely read that she's almost, you know, a subject for a book unto herself. And the work that she does, that it left me almost with little space to talk about anyone else. And I really, when I thought about other writers of detective fiction engaging Orthodox women, it was sort of as her literary descendants rather than as separate, independent beings.
You also bring in other ways of looking at reality. So, for example, sociology or history. And that's really a shift of gears from looking at these artistic creations. Can you talk a little bit about how historical and sociological studies are different, and in what ways you found them useful?
Yeah, absolutely. So this was something that I gave quite a bit of thought to. I'm a literary critic by training, and so I really think very much about representation. But one of the things that I realized as I was working on this project is it's almost impossible to talk about those representations, or at least for me it was, without also thinking about what's going on in these communities. And particularly, I think I gave a talk at some point early in the project that was quite critical of the representations of women as oppressed victims, and a man in the crowd said, "These women are oppressed victims. Look at what Haredi men are doing to them. why are you there vindicating them? And I said, oh, well, I'm actually talking about representations, not reality. But it sort of made me really aware that actually separating the two out completely isn't fair, right? That we should be thinking about the relationship. And I think one of the places that maybe I do this in a way that really shows the need for it is in that chapter about the women's film industry. I talk about a film that uses as its premise women in Brooklyn being sent to the back of the bus. This, of course, is true. There were many articles written about it a few years ago. This is something that happens in Israel also. But this is a real incident where women are being told that there needs to be gender segregation on the buses. Men and women can't come into contact, and therefore they have their own separate space. And the way the film takes it on is really interesting because ultimately, as a film that's done within the confines of this community, it has to justify that behavior. And that's actually hard for me to watch, right? Because I see it and my instinctive reaction is, but that's not okay, right? We shouldn't be sending women, we shouldn't be justifying sending women to the back of the bus. So that was actually, some of those films were painful for me to watch as a feminist. But I think it's interesting and it's important to put those in conversation with each other, what's really going on, but then also how it gets used within the creative spaces of these women. What are they doing? Why are they telling this story? They know this story, right? They know that they're being sent to the back of the bus. So how do they negotiate these issues within the space of the film? And that's what I think is key.
Yeah, at the same time, sometimes in fiction, it's easier to talk about the injustices. What I'm thinking of specifically is Ayala Fader's book, Mitzvah Girls, that you bring in.
Yeah.
You would not know from reading Mitzvah Girls that there are some Mitzvah girls who are miserable. They all seem very happy to be indoctrinated into the proper lifestyle for women in that culture. Whereas if we look at any of the authors who you deal with, there are often portraits of people who, for one reason or another, are not happy with the options that they have. So it does seem like the arts give more leeway
I think
to talk
so.
about people.
What's interesting about that film too is that the character who challenges women being sent to the bus is an off the derech character, right? She's a character who's left Orthodoxy, but then is so convinced by the reasons given to her for gender segregation that she returns to the fold. But the fact that she's off at some point, again, it's something that you can say within fiction, but you wouldn't want to actually, within that community, tell a story of someone leaving the fold as any kind of good story, right?
Mm-hmm. So you think about all of the many, many, many things that you read and watched. What are your 3 favorite treatments of Orthodox women?
So that's hard. I've really enjoyed the Barry Deutsch graphic novels. And it's one of the reasons that I start with his fiction. Part of it is I also want to suggest that this is not just Orthodox women writing Orthodox women, right? That now we have more than that, and we still can get a nuanced, interesting approach. But I loved his series because I thought that he does a great job of normalizing, right? So the yet another troll fighting Orthodox Jewish 11-year-old girl, right? So this could be within the range of normal in the same way that Ms. Marvel is a character who's Pakistani and Muslim and a superhero for Marvel Comics, right? So I loved the way he does that, and I just thought it was rich in a way that I hadn't seen before, and again, it also shows that it's not just about insider, autoethnography, but really anyone who's talented and willing to be sensitive can write a beautiful depiction of Orthodox womanhood. So that would be one of my favorites. I loved writing about the music. So I talk about Bulletproof Stockings, which no longer exists, and Peril, who does exist, and I talk a little bit about their lyrics and about what they do in their lyrics and how they assert a space for feminine empowerment, both in the lyrics and also in the structure, because they're women who sing only for women, right? So they create these all women spaces. And one of the things that's come out in the aftermath of the book is I say, I wish that one of these bands had written a kind of Eshes Chayil for the modern age, right? That trope gets taken up so many times in this literature, but not in the music. And since then it has. Actually, Peril wrote a song which comes in at the end of the film 93 Queen, the film about Ruchi Fryer. And it is a modern rendition of the Eshes Chayil, and it's absolutely beautiful. Is that two? Did I get two so far?
That's two. Yeah.
So I guess the third, and when I say favorite, I don't mean favorite in quite the same way, but I'm going to say looking at those films was very interesting for me. And as I said, actually very hard for me in many ways because of the kind of arguments that are essentially made that undergird those films strike me at first as what feels very anti-feminist, what feels like putting women in their place, putting women back in the home. The film that I talk about that involves a businesswoman who ultimately realizes that she's spending too much time at work when she should be at home, and the only president she should be, the only company she should be the president of is her family. That was hard for me, and that was, I think, very much outside of my range. And as a result, I actually came to really enjoy working on that.
So it sounds to me like the third example that you mentioned is something that was, wave your arms.
I am.
Is something that was done for a didactic reason. In
Yes.
other words, the film was an advocacy. If you compare that to some of the novels by people who hopefully are writing to try to delve into the truth of human relationships rather than to convince people to feel a certain way.
Yeah.
Does that make a difference? Did you find more objectionable materials in the advocacy didactic productions than you did in the things that had been written from the viewpoint of a particular artist, but not from an institutional framework?
I mean, to be honest, Sylvia, I think that the Price Above Rubies kind of film is also advocating a particular viewpoint. It's just the opposite viewpoint. So I think those two have, in some ways, equally objectionable material. They're so determined to convince the viewers, it feels to me, that their way is the right way, that it's hard to just sit back and say, where's the, can I just enjoy this story? So I think there's a lot of that goes on, and I think it goes on. I just showed the film Submission to my students today. It's the film by Ayaan Hirsi Ali and Theo van Gogh, the film that got him killed in 2004. And I wanted to show it to them to show how it's called Submission, which of course is a translation of the word Islam. And it's really about, it's a very anti-Islam. It's about how women are forced to submit within Islam. And it's got a very clear agenda, right? So I think a lot of these have agendas. And whenever the agenda gets to be too big, the nuance gets lost. We end up relying on stereotypes either way, or a puff piece, right? I think in the films by Orthodox women that I look at, they are puff pieces to a degree, but I think the reason I said I ended up enjoying them is that there are subversive, if you want to call it that, elements in them. There are things that press against the grain. The endings resolve very, very pat, right? They're very neat. But the middle sections are not neat, right? And if we take the whole thing into account, that's where I really see them working out these questions, trying to figure out what's okay, where can you push, where shouldn't you push, right? So I actually think there's a lot in there.
That's really interesting. Here's a question from our viewing audience.
Okay.
Are you aware of the fact that some high schools, some Jewish day school high schools, have been discussing Tova Mervis's memoir, The Book of Separation?
Okay.
And there's a fair amount of controversy. People feel very strongly that it's appropriate. Some people feel not. Have you encountered that book? Do you have any thoughts about using that book in that way?
Well, I'm laughing because if I'm completely honest, it arrived in the mail yesterday.
Oh.
So if you ask me next week, I'll have a much better answer for the book. I've heard mixed reviews about the book, and I think her novels are actually quite sophisticated. I like her novels. She's very funny, but I have heard that her memoir doesn't quite have the same kind of strength in terms of its writing. But I shouldn't comment on it because I haven't read it. But I think it fits in the larger genre, right? It fits in the larger genre of women feeling that there's no place for them within Orthodoxy to be the creative people that they want to be or whatever, and so leaving that community.
This really, your response is actually very connected to the question that I raised earlier, whether writing fiction actually gives people more freedom. Because if it's not about you, then the various shades of feeling as well as behavior that different people have can perhaps be more honestly explored in fiction than in memoir.
I agree.
Well, how about you? Do you feel that you have a particular interpretive viewpoint that influences how you analyze Orthodox female characters, or what you're looking for when you critique fiction and film about them?
So I come at the text, or I certainly came at the text with a very strong feminist lens. But I think what happened is I learned to recalibrate what that means. So I think not just with the women's film industry, but actually with the whole collection of texts that I was looking at, what I came to think about in terms of my own feminism and my own ideas of feminism is actually how limited they were and how rooted they were in a secular approach. So I guess, to say a feminist approach would be a bit simplified. What I was looking for was the ways that the texts stretch that idea and often challenge it. I mean, certainly within Haredi circles, there is a resistance to using that term feminist. And yet so many of the ideas articulated suggest feminism to me. So really thinking about what that meant, I think, was what changed along the way.
So you have various gradations of feminism, or maybe various varieties of feminism.
I think varieties, because I think that what happens is when there's a great line. I'll say this. This was one of my favorite lines of a text maybe ever. I wrote it down to remind myself. It was from Rebecca Goldstein's The Mind-Body Problem. And she talks about how Orthodox women were never put on the same pedestal as Christian women. They were never the angel in the house. But then she says, in a world where merit is measured in the number of pages of the Talmud one has mastered, power doesn't rest in bringing home the kosher beef fry. I love that line. I think it really sums it up, that when we want to talk about things like women's work and women going out in the workplace, things along those lines that we often look for in feminist texts, right? We look at a lot of texts where there's a striving to work, to make money, to have independence. Actually, those aren't the same kinds of issues that we're going to be looking for in these texts about Orthodox women. So even in A Price Above Rubies, which I'm quite critical of, in an early part of it, do you remember this story? I'm sort of assuming that people remember this film, but in an early part of it, the brother-in-law, the evil brother-in-law, says to the Renee Zellweger character, "Why don't you work out of your basement? All the women in Borough Park do it." Right? I think it's Borough Park, might be Crown Heights, right? In other words, working, and she says, I can't work, I have a baby. He's like, this is what all the women here do, right? So that's not the way we should be, those aren't the questions we should be asking. Are women allowed to work? Can women make their own money? Can women forge independence in that way?
So that's really interesting, and I've had the same question actually, because women in Europe, as you point out, worked. In Ashkenazi families. It was very, very common. Even the wives of Rebbes worked. It's only in the Sephardic community that it was more looked down on. So the attitude that the woman encounters in Catterskill Falls, or the attitude that you talked about in those films where they try to make women feel like they should not be ambitious, that was puzzling to me, because it wasn't part of the European sensibility. Do you have any insights into why the Orthodox world has in some ways become stricter about that?
So I'm not wholly sure that it is, and I'm not sure that those texts are using the right framework. It seems to me a bit of a non-traditionally Jewish framework, and a way of building up some of the tension of women who are oppressed in some way and need to emerge, right? Sort of relying on a more American framework, if you will. That said, there's certainly been waves, right? There are certainly changes within particularly Haredi communities where women worked, women didn't work, women had to go to work to support their husbands, right? And then there was a big push, and in fact, women have now, particularly in Israel, gone into so many, the tech field is full of Haredi women, right? These are the women out in the world. These are the women really engaging with the larger world around them. But in Catterskill Falls, and I love the book, and I think it's a nuanced, beautiful book, but that did bother me as a kind of motive for why she needs to rebel in order to create her story. I think it feels somewhat inauthentic. And that's why I think Rebecca Goldstein does a more honest version of it, both in The Mind-Body Problem and also in Muzzle. Similarly, we see really the working mother, right? And there's no contradiction of terms.
Right, yeah. Actually, from A Price Above Rubies, one of the scenes I remember vividly is when the Renee Zellweger character first starts to work outside the home
Yeah.
her sense of elation when
Yeah.
she's walking down the street.
I remember it.
Neighborhood. And it's almost, you feel that she could almost fly. She's so excited, almost like she's an astronaut. And she's out there. Of course, her brother-in-law brings her down to earth very quickly.
Right.
But I thought that was one of the things that the movie actually did very well. That sense of entrapment and then release.
Right.
Let me ask you.
Okay, sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think that something that's genuine there is there are communities in Brooklyn where Brooklyn and Manhattan, although they're only separated by a very small body of water, feel worlds apart.
Absolutely. It's not just John Travolta and Saturday Night Fever.
That's right.
So what hasn't been done yet? If you could ask a writer or filmmaker to create a piece of fiction or film that would present an Orthodox woman in a way that hasn't been done before, or hasn't been done effectively before, what would your assignment to them sound like?
It's a great question. And I'm sorry I'm not in the creative arts to have a great answer to it. But I will say that now I feel that I've seen a film that does maybe everything I want, and that is 93 Queen. I thought it was, so this is the film about Ruchi Fryer, the judge who starts Ezras Nashim, the women's emergency medical service in New York. And the reason I love this film is because of the nuance involved in it. I think that it has a very clear hero of the story, a heroine, right, Ruchi Fryer, and it's about her rise, and it's about her challenges primarily within the community to convince the men of her role. But I think what I really liked about it is that she's not, she's a flawed heroine, right? So we see tensions between her and other women. So there's a moment, for example, where she makes this decision that only married women should be involved because unmarried women shouldn't see what goes on if there's a miscarriage or a delivery and so on. And this creates a whole tension within the emergency medical service that she's built up. And she doesn't emerge as right in any way, right? She emerges actually as a bit of a tyrant. But I like that because I think that it shows us, other issues, not just about being an Orthodox woman, but about the rise to power and the way it affects people and what people do with that power, right? So I just thought it was really good, really interesting, didn't rely on stereotypes in any way, had a range of different women involved in it, and showed flaws.
Great. That's really a wonderful point. Here are a couple more questions from our viewing audience.
Okay.
Have you compared the modern Orthodox novels with those written by some of the novels of women who grew up conservative, like Dara Horn or Amy Gottlieb? That's the first one.
I mean, I would love to, and I haven't really spent a lot of time looking at conservative Jewish life, I'll say, but I didn't try to restrict this book to writings by Orthodox women or women who are within the community. And even, so that film I just mentioned, and I don't talk about it, but that's a film by a modern Orthodox woman about a Haredi woman, something like Catterskill Falls. I'm not sure that Allegra Goodman would fall under the category of orthodoxy. So I'm a little bit less concerned about where the writer, the denomination of the writer. Mary Deutsch certainly is not Orthodox. But I think it would be really interesting to look at some of the depictions of conservative Jewish life and conservative Jewish women, and what are different limitations and different stereotypes that get trotted out there.
Do you see any novels about Orthodox women rabbis? Now that there is such a thing in real life, is anyone writing novels about that?
I look forward to it. I haven't seen it happen yet, but it will.
Yes, yeah. Well, why don't you talk about this very interesting artwork on the front of the book?
Thank you. I love the artwork. So it took me quite a while to find what I was looking for, and I went back and forth with the press, and we discussed options. And I wanted something that wasn't stereotypical. In other words, I didn't want a picture of a woman lighting Shabbat candles. I didn't want a picture of a woman holding a baby. I wanted it to really show that idea of the diversity of Orthodox womanhood. And actually, before I came across this picture, I came across a drawing of an Orthodox woman at the Met by a student who's now at Barnard. Her name is Alex Gluckman, and she drew this Orthodox woman drawing on her iPad, painting at the Met. And I chased this down, and I got in touch. I was friends with the dean at Barnard, so that's on the inside. And I spoke to her, and as it happened, when I continued looking, I found that picture from the Met that had been painted on an iPad online by this very artist. Her name is Elka Riva Sudin. And she had also painted this picture on her iPad, so really about the modernity of Peril, which is the band that I talk about in the book. So it was something that was both meaningful to me. It's a picture of Peril, which is part of the subject. It's by an Orthodox woman, so it really shows an Orthodox woman's creative possibilities. And it was somebody that had been represented by yet another artist, which features inside the book. So I just thought it had a really nice story involved, as well as being really colorful and I think quite beautiful.
Sounds like it was Bashert.
I think it was Bashert.
Yeah. Do you have you read or you have any comments on Risa Miller's novels?
So I have read Risa Miller, and I'm trying to remember if I talk about her at all. So most of what I discuss in the book is more in the mostly American, not entirely. Risa Miller, I guess her work takes place in Israel, and I do talk a little bit about Israel, but not a great deal. In part out of my own trepidation. There are so many different political issues and also different ways of understanding Orthodoxy, different languages that get used, different political concerns, that I think I held back in really digging into Risa Miller and some of the other writers who write about Israel.
So my friend Deb Cram from Newton, Massachusetts says maybe the next time you'll take another look at her second novel, which is based in Brooklyn, Israel. I wonder if you have any thoughts about the movie Disobedience.
I do.
Please share them.
Yes, I've actually so I wrote a piece for The Conversation last week about Disobedience because it just came out here in the UK where I'm based. I had seen it because I had been back in North America in the summer. So it was really interesting to me. I did not love the film. But I think it does some important work. And the important work that I think it does is really bring to light some of the issues, some of the LGBT issues within the Orthodox community that have very long been ignored and only recently have been coming to the fore. So just a couple months ago, the chief rabbi of Great Britain and the Commonwealth addressed explicitly this issue of LGBT members of the community. He wrote a report about it, and And I don't think it does everything it needs to do, but it starts to tackle the issue. So I do think the film is very important in bringing that to the fore. I also think it's rather disappointing because I'm very familiar with the book, and I just think the book is a superior piece for a number of reasons. The two I'll highlight. First of all, it feels very much like it's filmed by a male director, which it is, but you really feel that watching it. The book felt to me a very feminist book, and it felt to me a very feminist book in part because one of the main characters, Esty, struggles throughout the book, and at the end she realizes that she has to take ownership of who she is and of her life. But in the film, that's not what happens. In the film, her husband turns to her in the synagogue. He is, of course, at the pulpit. She is off in the women's section, and he says, "I free you." Now, why that shift? Why do we have to move from a woman finding her own power and value to her husband offering to free her? I found that very disturbing and unnecessary. And the other issue that bothers me, and I read Naomi Alderman's response to it, it doesn't bother her, but it does bother me, is that at the end of the book, I don't think it's the most realistic ending perhaps, but that same character chooses to stay in the community and becomes something of a wise woman in the community because she has articulated this identity that's so unusual, that's so surprising that people think, well, I'll go tell Esty because actually, you know, she can handle this. She's not like the rest of us, right? And so she becomes, in the conclusion of the book, she is a wise woman to whom people look for advice. But in the film, we follow a very familiar trajectory. We see it in A Price Above Rubies. We see it in Felix et Meira. The only way that a woman can be free, and particularly that is a story for creativity and sexuality, is by leaving the community. And so at the end, we see her planning her escape. That's really interesting. I mean, it's you could project it backward even to Isaac Bashevis Singer's Yentl the Yeshiva Boy. Yeah. Where Yentl, unlike the Barbara Streisand film, was an entirely different animal. Yes. Yentl has no choice but to leave the community and to go off into a kind of purgatory, limbo. There's nothing really for her. So this business that exile is the only answer for a woman who's different. I don't know how unrealistic it is about people bringing their issues to a woman like that. I mean, many women who have decided to do something which is not typical. Yeah. In the old days, that even getting divorced, which was different than other people come to them and talk to them. Okay. So, well, I like it. I mean, I think that's good. So, what's your next project? What are you going to be working on next? Are you going to do something similar to this, or you have something entirely different, as Monty Python would say? My next project is similar, and the reason is it felt unfinished. Despite the range, it felt unfinished. And as I mentioned, you know, even sort of looking at the engagement with Instagram and this other kind of new media, but I would like to broaden it out to really think about the relationships among what I'm not sure if it will just be Muslim and Jewish women or possibly Muslim, Jewish, and Christian women, but I'm really interested in the ways that they use mainstream formats and then sort of adopt and do an adopt and adapt kind of move. So I was reading a series of romances, right? And they'll have these titles like No Sex in the City, or What was the other time? They have all these names, right? That love in a headscarf, and they take the traditional kind of chick lit approach, right? Woman on the drive for Mr. Right. Only in these novels, it's, you know, hijabi on the road for Mr. Right, who's a beardy, via Mecca, right? Or if you've seen the second film by Rama Burstein, have you seen the second film by her, The Wedding Plan? It's also called Breaking the Wall, right? So again, it very much follows that popular romance, all the tropes of the popular romance, but in order to find Mr. Religious Right, she has to go to Uman and pray over the grave of the Rebbe. So I'm really interested in that kind of use of popular culture that gets revised, and it does both. It sort of works both with a mainstream culture, but also modernizes the culture for themselves.
If you do decide to do the comparative project, I'd urge you to also include Mormon women.
All right.
Who many people have compared actually observant Jews to Mormons in terms of the fact that it's a clearly defined group. Anyway, either one of those sounds fabulous, and we look forward to having a conversation with you when you do the next book.
That sounds wonderful.
We've been talking to Dr. Karen Skinazi, a senior teaching fellow and the director of liberal arts at the University of Bristol in the UK. And thank you for joining us, and we look forward to the next conversation.
Thank you, Sylvia.